As an illustrator, sometimes it's just really fun to exaggerate a foreshortened pose so much that it becomes forced perspective. I'm going to show you how I turned this reference into this illustration in forced perspective, looking up at this character from the viewpoint of a rodent. It takes a few iterations and planning, but I'll share the breakdown and my entire creative process so that you too can try drawing something like this yourself. Let's say this is my reference and I want to push it. I want to find a way to make it foreshortened, and I'm going to try to foreshorten it where we're looking up at him instead of looking down. So finding the silhouette, overall pose, but some things that I'm trying to keep an eye on is the zigzag. So when you're trying to find how to push a pose and how to find the balance of things is like finding the zigzag and kind of finding the three main points of the pose, and usually that's like the head to the torso, the overall body, and then the lean that's happening in the leg. And for him, he's doing that whole like lean back, but the head is leaning forward to balance out the body. So I'm just trying to use that, and in order to add foreshortening, what I need to look for are things like his ground plane. So his ground plane right now, I would say it's kind of like right there. It's usually you want to put it around the heel area, and if it helps as well, sometimes it's good to put a ellipse so you understand roughly what the dimensions are. This could help too when you're doing a foreshortened piece, because what it does is like, okay, if I need to foreshorten it and I want to push it more like we're looking up at the person, so maybe the horizon line is down here, it means that I would make the ellipse then thinner. So then this way we can really push the sizes of the feet, and it makes it look like the camera's closer to the ground. So what I would do, as I usually do with poses like this, is I would push the angle of the foot, make this back foot thinner and smaller. What I'm also doing is trying to find different angles, change how things are pointing in different directions. So don't have everything be parallel or it starts leaning into that static aspect of it. I also like how baggy the pants are, so that's why I'm giving a bit more of like sharper angles with like the sweats and thinning it out near the feet. The head can be like smaller. And as always, when it comes to coming up with ideas, it's always good to try to do different approaches. But at the end of the day, it's about like doing multiple versions and seeing which one works the best. Number one was fine. I do like that spacing in the neck, but he has this hood here, so I feel like I could play up that hood, get chunkier at the top, have the body be obscured a little bit more. I really want to push the leg, so I realized that the body has to lean way more back. What I'm trying to do here is play around with different shape languages. The first one is kind of like thin and then expanding downwards, whereas the second one is more of like, I want it big at the top and thin at the bottom. So this is meant to be very free-flowing, very loose, and kind of the ideation stage and phase. And then, because foreshortening is very technical, it's like, how do you take the rough, loose idea stage and map out the technical onto it? So what I'm trying to do with the clothing is to capture the messy, baggy folds right above the cuffs, then the transition into the cuffs that are straight and tight, then back to the chaotic shape in the shoes. This back and forth rhythm is crucial in capturing the streetwear pants style that I really want to capture in this specific drawing, so that is why I'm going about it in this way. Composition and also drawing people just takes time. It's a mixture of like, do you want to go for realism? How much stylized do you want to push it to be? Like what type of style you want to go for? Like all those things are that you have to consider. think if there's anything like a takeaway from composition is just no tangents, and always a good starting rule is don't make anything symmetrical. Even if it's smack dab in the middle, everything from that point on, it's kind of like up to you. When I'm exaggerating a pose, I like to approach poses with a zigzagging type of motion. If the pose is too straight, then it'll feel kind of boring or too static. So by adding changes in angles and zigzags, it allows for an overall upright pose to feel like it has more momentum to it and keep the eyes moving around the figure. Kind of just taking the rough outfit of this guy and just slowly changing it into something that I want. So I'm finding the flow of the lines and shapes a bit too straight, and it's keeping the figure a little stiff. So I'm playing around with the proportions of the body in comparison to the legs and the force perspective of the back leg to see what feels best in terms of the flow of the pose overall. So right now I'm just finessing it. Just experimenting with like the different blocking and the different shapes, but twisting is good. If you ever go into like character design, or like if you're literally just drawing one character, there's no background, there's nothing, then the composition is how you lay out the pose, and it's always good to consider the shapes, proportions, angles, contrast, the flow. This is like a good approach where I'm like twisting it. The front body is twisting towards the camera a little bit, but the feet are turning away from the camera. Should be a contrast, but like right now this isn't contrasting with this. I should probably have something up here that contrasts that, like the hat. So sometimes I find that it helps to also just draw a prism first and see if you can get the correct twist and proportions in the way that you want it to be. So that, well, one, your drawing feels grounded, but also that you have kind of like the correct trajectory for your drawing. So I'm gonna combine number 4 and 2. You can be super realistic with foreshortening by making sure you're placing down all the prisms properly and all that kind of stuff. Or if you want to exaggerate and really push the pose a lot, you just have to make sure things are moving in a consistent rate. So kind of like this prism over here, it's all a descending or foreshortening into the distance at a consistent rate, and I think that's all you really need. So when you draw the arms and you're like including the things like folds and all that kind of stuff, you do want to keep in mind that the folds are probably going to be more like this rather than like this. There's not really going to be any folds going in this direction, because if you do draw folds that way, it more implies that we're looking at it head on, and you want to sell the illusion as much as possible that things are overlapping. So like you've got the head is going one way, and then you got the body which is going another way, and I'm thinking about them of like also their dimension and their volume. And then we got the hips going in another way, and because it's foreshortened, you can kind of get away with very exaggerated and very pushed and unbelievable proportions. This is how I would separate and break up the body. I'm kind of breaking it up into these 4 sections, and I'm making sure in ratio that they're getting bigger and bigger than the next part. Videos like these wouldn't be possible without our awesome patrons and YouTube members who help our mission of making arts education free and accessible for everyone. Become a member today and unlock cool perks like exclusive chats with our creators, access to class recordings, and critique from instructors. So with all the different variations and exploration of the pose, I'm trying to include elements that I like from the different quote-unquote variations that I came up with. I'm including things like how the upper chest portion drops back in version 2, how the feet is placed slightly higher and visible like in version 3, and the perspective explored with the cylindrical-like masses in the mannequin that I drew next to the blue prism. As I clean up the lines and I add in all the details, like all these things are going to change the way this drawing and figure will feel, but this is kind of like my template. This is kind of what I'm going to rely on to help me build and structure the overall drawing, because even though there's not a lot of detail in this drawing, the big takeaway that I have with it are the proportions, where things are going, how things are aligned, and the other thing are the negative shapes and the angles, making sure things are offset, they're balanced, it's constantly contrasting each other, there's no parallel lines. I'm playing a lot with these drastic, exaggerated angles, making sure things feel bigger, are kind of like contrasting in size, like this shoe is way bigger than this one over here. Like, I'm playing around with all these things to constantly keep the figure lively and interesting and not just static, or else the foreshortened picture just looks like you're taking the picture at a low ground and the person's just getting smaller and that's it. It doesn't make it interesting necessarily. These jaggedy bits and these change of angles and this kind of balance on the other side, and then how the leg just kind of like shoots out this way. But I liked kind of the bulkiness that I have in number 4 and like the shoe design, so I tried combining aspects of those two things into this newer one while also trying to continually push it. So that's why it's been taking so long to get it, because I'm kind of tweaking the movement and the flow of it while trying to figure out also like making sure foreshortening works and everything. So what I ended up doing is like I wanted to make sure this popped collar or the part of the jacket is angular over there, and then it shoots out this way, and then I want the elbow to like come out over here. I'm trying to find ways to constantly offset the drawing so it's not super clean. There's a lot of things for me to push around in terms of like the outfit, push around in terms of like the drawing and the pose. So beforehand, the pose looked closer to like this. The problem with this though, that even though the drawing has a lot of these like changing angles to it, the overall positioning is pretty centered. It's very straight, and to an extent it's still that with this one, but that's kind of why I like at the very end I took this top half and lasso tooled it, shifted it over to the right side, just offset it a little bit, but I still wanted it to be balanced. So it's way more offset because now I have a bigger negative space pocket over here, and it's kind of counterbalanced by another negative space kind of pocket on the other side. But the head is still balanced, but now a little bit better. So I've been trying to find ways to keep it interesting, so things like the angles, trying to like constantly counteract it all the time, trying to make the shoe in the back make sense, even though it's like perspective wise it might be like way over exaggerated. Like, in order for him to stand like this, he would have to be a really, really wide stance. That would be kind of uncomfortable. But because I have the foot that far back, I'm allowed to kind of really push the limits. So yeah, that's kind of like my thought process right now, is to like make sure nothing is like parallel with one another. So beforehand, the pants legs were kind of parallel, so I was trying to find ways to push it. So I added a little bit more breaks in the pants just so that it keeps it interesting, it changes it while maintaining the overall flow that I want. I'm constantly pushing and changing and adjusting things just so that it kind of gets to that right amount so that it works technically but is also visually interesting. And a big part of that is also just like warping the shoe front a lot as well. I'm still following a lot of my rules of size, proportion, distribution, making sure it's larger, things are closer, and diminishing as they get further away from the viewer or the camera, while also keeping in mind of overlaps. When it comes to foreshortening, it's just maintaining those two rules, but then it's like you have to kind of take into consideration of everything else. So anatomy, overall body proportions, aesthetic, flow, counterweight, negative space, like all these things you need to keep in mind while tying it all together with the two main core rules of foreshortening, which is scale and overlap. So off camera, I took the rough drawing and cleaned it up a little bit and added a bit more details in the clothing, but not too much detail. I want to save all that effort for the final piece. So I'm adding things like the pocket and folds and the hands that I obviously didn't really quite fully flesh out in the rough drawing, but I'm kind of like, I'll leave that off till later as I clean up the drawing. So that's the underneath drawing, but right now the clean drawing that you're seeing right now that I'm doing in a darker red, that is where I'm going to put a little bit more effort in. So when I'm drawing, I like to use red lines to draw just because it stands out, and it's reminiscent of how I like to draw traditionally with a red pencil crayon, sometimes when I'm doing personal portraits. It also helps distinguish itself from the black lines, which I tend to kind of relate to being the final line work, so having that visual distinction is how I like to see it. In my head, as I'm going over this, I am treating this like it will be the final or close to the final stage, but it's like right there, neck and neck. So I'm putting in more attention to the details and design of the characters, so that's what this stage is. The approach that I do here is something that I saw in a graphic novel, which is to color in the entire figure and use very drastic and intense colors, so you can see it later as you color in the actual colors itself. It's just more of a visual distinction, but not really anything too important or having any like real reason as to why I do this. But having a silhouette fill is really good because it allows you at least to see the silhouette and how your figure looks as a whole. Here I realize I'm most likely going to keep the line drawing, and I'm not going to be doing one more clean pass or another layer. Sometimes I like to do multiple line drawings just to really finesse and clean things up, but for this one I actually wanted to keep some of the random chaos that happens and some of just the random movements that my pen has as I'm trying to flesh and carve out the drawing. So that's kind of why I'm going to keep the line drawing here. That messiness and energy from my stylus traveling around the tablet, it's actually this really cool bit of texture that I like to keep in some of my drawings, and something that I'm kind of incorporating into my drawings more and more, and moving away from having really pristine and perfect clean drawings. I think having textured and rough line work adds a bit more personality in the drawing that I personally like. I know it's not for everybody, but that's kind of just like my little bit of taste, adding a bit of grit and nuance and noise to the line work. So that's kind of why I kept the rough drawing and I didn't do another full pass, is because I actually wanted to keep that messiness. So personally, I love drawing with very angular lines, so I picked a brush that has just a little bit of texture. It's called Bristle 1. It's kind of like this green brush that has like multiple spots. If you zoom in and make the brush really big, it has like multiple points, so it's not a very pinpoint brush. But because of this, it's not super smooth, it's not perfect. It has a little bit of texture just due to the having multiple points and not just one singular point on the brush head, and has a little bit of unpredictableness and nuances in the brush. So that's kind of why I picked it, because it still allows me to be precise while having a little bit of messiness to it. So all the details in the folds and in the shape of the jacket is carrying on that theme of and mindset of messy but precise and intentional. Every mark that I'm making has a purpose to it, like folds and dimension and volume to it, but I'm kind of approaching it very messily and being very angular and loose with it, so it's not like too clean, but also being exactly where it needs to be. And I'm also adding a bit of perspective actually to the line work itself. As I get to the pants, as you'll later see down the line, I'm actually playing around with the thickness in the lines. And again, it works with the messy and chaotic nature of my line work, but it adds just that little bit of visual hint to having an exaggerated perspective. The lines and the pants and closer to the shoes are much messier and much bigger, and the line work is really large. And I kind of did that with the brush so that it plays on that aspect of a forced perspective. Things that are closer to you are going to be larger, and the things further away are going to be smaller. So the pants and the shoes are drawn with thicker line work, whereas if you go up to the body and like the jacket and the face, you'll notice that the lines are kind of a little bit more delicate and a little bit quote-unquote cleaner, whereas the lines on the pants are chunkier, way more edgier and rougher. And even if I do erase some stuff, I kind of keep it, so there's actually a little bit more detail and nuance in the brushwork itself, whereas the stuff closer to the body and the face are just a little bit thinner and don't have as much of a nuance compared to the pants. And as I'm drawing this too, you'll notice that I'm erasing here and there, and I'm actually trying to keep some of the unerased parts. So I might erase, but I won't fully erase everything. And the reason why is because it again adds to that texture to the drawing. By having some missed lines or like parts that I didn't erase properly, you can kind of see what the original drawing was, and it kind of implies just this like really speedy, almost rushed nature in the drawing. But I don't know, it kind of worked. This is a style that I'm still kind of experimenting around with, but I'm really liking how this works and coming out. The line drawing and inspiration, I'm taking a little bit of cues from things like Persona and like Hellboy. So Mike Mignola kind of just has heavier line works, kind of random marks on the body or on the jacket to add texture and cracks and shadows in the figure. And I'm also kind of outlining the shadows, so it just again creates like this interesting flow and shape in the overall figure itself. And you'll see that I also am adding those extra lines and just these I also think they're kind of like random squiggles on the face, but I really like it. You know, it adds a bit of just more nuances to it. And this is something that I really like too, is just adding these directional lines. It adds a bit of more momentum to the drawing. So off camera, I quickly changed the fill to red instead of blue. There's not really any super important reason to it. Sometimes it's because it's easier to see. The original light blue was maybe a little bit too light, or I found it a little bit too light, so I changed it to red. Other times it just might be better in offsetting the color scheme I'll be coloring the character in later on. So for example, or if I'm going to be coloring this jacket orange, then having a pink base color would blend into the orange a little bit easier. So sometimes that might be the reason. But honestly, the other reason is just because I'm feeling the pink more than the blue. There's not really any kind of important or concrete reason. It's just kind of that's what I'm feeling. What I like to do is I like to split up my layers based on the individual elements that I will be coloring. So the jacket gets its own layer, the skin gets its layer, the hat, the pants, etc. You get the gist. This way I can change the colors really easily while keeping the painting texture that's super subtle. It's like a little secret that you'll only notice if you zoom right in, but our eyes are actually quite sensitive enough that they can pick up the subtlety of it. So I then use Krita's group clipping feature. So if you right click on a layer, you'll see a group option, and then it'll expand to another window that says clipping group. So if you click that, it basically makes it so that whatever thing that you painted, so for example the jacket, it's the orange thing, I will now only be able to color inside of the orange fill that I did for the jacket, and I don't have to worry about coloring outside the lines, and I can change the color really easily, keep the texture, and yeah, makes picking colors and figuring out a color scheme way more accessible and just way easier. Hello, so this is future Josh here, and yes, this is the final drawing, but a little bit of a sneak peek. I actually originally had a different color scheme for my character. I actually wanted a more retro look. So this was actually a version that I did beforehand. After I colored it in this way, I just did not quite like it as much, but originally the jacket was going to be orange with like green kind of cargo pants, but then after I colored it all in and I looked at it, it reminded me a little bit of like Scooby-Doo or Ed, Edd n Eddy, which those aren't bad things by no means, but it just wasn't the vibe or the direction that I wanted to go in. So even though the color schemes is kind of neat, it's very 2000s, very 90s, I just didn't end up going with it. So this was one approach. And so I went in a completely different direction, which is to go for more of like this red purple jacket. And obviously the pants ended up staying pretty much the same color from this point on. I knew I wanted more green cargo pants, but I wasn't sure how dark or how desaturated I wanted to make them. So I was kind of playing around, but this is kind of the final version. And over here, actually, you can see why I do the whole clipping group and the clipping mask approach, and why I fill it all in with one fill first, is because you'll have little touches like this where you can see a bit of the texture and it stays there, but I don't have to worry about coloring outside of the lines. I don't have to worry about coloring outside and on top of these textures, because the clipping group keeps them. And you can clearly see here that I went for a more like the normal lighter skin tone type of approach, and then I was like, you know what, the colors are already kind of crazy, they're already super intense and saturated. Let's see if I can pull off doing a pink color. But yeah, and then you can clearly see like that this is why I keep the textures here, because you can see it in the pants later on. Yeah, this is kind of the final approach, but we are jumping ahead of ourselves a little bit because we haven't gotten to this part of the coloring process. But I just wanted to show a little bit of what it used to look like before we got to the final version. Because the colors in general are so intense, I can actually get away with making the face pink in color. That's actually kind of why I picked a really intense red for the background. The face in contrast, or in comparison to the background, will come off a little bit more toned down even though it's a straight up pink face. But because the jacket and the pants are green, it still has a bit of a punch and saturation in the color, like that pink skin tone, and not look too dull. But also in general, pink is kind of a skin tone that we do have. Yes, it's a little bit more orange in a lighter skin tone, but pink is a little bit like in our skin tone, so we can kind of just go along with it and be like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, that works as a skin tone. Join a virtual class in seconds and learn live from professional artists. Enjoy weekly assignments, individual guidance, and real-time feedback on your artwork so you can create like a fearless illustrator. If you learned something new, please like and share this with a fellow art nerd. If you love receiving quality and free arts education, subscribe. Here's a couple other videos you can check out next.